So let's get going. There won't be a class on Monday for obvious reasons. Uh, well, um, okay, I'm going to do the Portuguese Empire, which, believe it or not, is a really interesting subject, and then I'm going to proceed to do the Spanish Empire, which initiates the European expansion. So, um, when we speak about the European expansion um, in the 16th century, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about, first of all, obviously the conquest of Latin America, and uh, that's one thing, and then uh, the uh, establishment of ongoing relations between Europe and Asia. These two things, the conquest of Latin America and the European contact with Asia, the establishment of that connection. Um, the the uh, remaining sort of unfolding of European expansion was rather gradual, so that you see that they only really take over India in the 18th century. They undermine the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century. Um, it's true that the Europeans were present in Asia on the periphery of many of the countries of Asia. But for example, in China, in Korea, in Japan, their attempt to sort of move inward to gain a real influence was rebuffed by the rulers of these countries. The Portuguese came in and they were very aggressive, and not only in terms of their commercial relations, but also they brought missionaries with them and tried to implant Christianity. And in each of these three countries, they were rebuffed. The rulers and the elites um, said that these Europeans were disruptive and violent. And so they were expelled from China and from Korea and Japan at the beginning of the 17th century. And it was only in the second half of the 19th century that the Europeans began to really take over in Asia, except for India, obviously, in the 18th century. So it's only in the 18th century then they conquer India and they begin to penetrate the Middle East. And really, yes, the Spanish and the Portuguese take over Latin America, but North America basically remains indigenous until the 19th century. And as for Africa, although contact is very early, the Europeans really don't move in terms of establishing their direct rule until the latter part of the 19th century. So what I've just said is basically that the European penetration of the rest of the world is a gradual thing. In the 16th century, it's commercial relations with Asia and, yes, indeed, the conquest of Latin America. That's the way it went. Um, now, um, even so, even having said that, nevertheless, the achievements of the Europeans in the 16th century were quite considerable. In that, of course, with these great ocean-going vessels, these sailing ships, this is quite unprecedented. The Europeans were operating now in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, and beyond that, in the Mediterranean. with their powerful, the ships were equipped with cannons and other weapons, and so they dominated the high seas. And moreover, in terms of overall economic change, the Europeans basically, for the first time, really created a world economy. Of course, I said that in Eurasia there was this overland trade, but it was very thin. It was not significant. Whereas starting in the 16th century, the exchanges between Europe and the rest of the world, particularly Asia and Latin America, you're talking about really large volumes of exports and imports. By the end of the 16th century, this is a very substantial part of the economy, and moreover, the most profitable part of the economy. So that's really quite important. Before that, as I said, the Eurasian trade was limited. Transportation was very difficult. I mean, you had camels, you had horses, you had donkeys, but moving goods across Eurasia from China or from India to Europe was very expensive and very difficult. And so only very expensive products could be transported. Things like spices, which brought a lot of profit, or silks, or sometimes porcelain. This kind of luxury goods was what was moved across the deserts and the arid plateaus of Asia into Europe. But there was no bulk trade, is what I'm saying, between these two areas. Whereas with the ocean-going vessels, you, for the first time, begin to get the movement of things like sugar and fish and gold and silver across oceans, because these vessels can carry at a relatively low expense these kinds of products. Now, the first of these, the first nation to really begin this process of overseas discovery and exploration were the Portuguese, as I said. Now, Portugal, we don't really, I mean, it is not central to the consciousness of Northern Europeans or North Americans. And to speak the truth, it was a small country. Of course, it's a tourist destination. It has very nice beaches, and it has a magnificent culture, does Portugal. But it isn't really central to the sort of consciousness of the North, like, say, Spain or Italy. No, Portugal is on the periphery. It's part of the Iberian Peninsula. It's in the western part. It was, like Spain, sort of a product of the Crusades of the Middle Ages. But it only had about 900,000 people at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. Less than 1 million people, which is not a substantial number of people. It didn't have the kind of impact that places like France and Spain or England had as a substantial power. Nevertheless, it plays this important role. Now, we begin the story of the Portuguese expansion not in Portugal itself, but we have to look across the across the Mediterranean Sea to what today is the country of Turkey, which at that moment, Turkey, in the time that we're speaking of, was occupied by the Turks. The Ottoman Empire was consolidating itself. And the key event in the consolidation of the Ottoman Empire was the seizure of the city of Constantinople. the Constantinople was an old Christian city. It was basically populated by people of the Greek Orthodox faith, and it looked back to the Roman Empire, and it was true that this city was founded by a Roman emperor. I believe the year was 323. The Emperor Constantine founded the city of Constantinople, and it endured throughout the Middle Ages down to 1453 as a Christian outpost in a world which by then had become Muslim. It was a stronghold of Christianity. Now, the Christians, Greek, but especially the West European Christians, had invaded the Middle East during the so-called Crusades, which started at the end of the 11th century. You've heard about the Crusades. Well, there were a whole succession of these attempts on the part of the West Europeans, especially the nobility, to basically conquer the holy places in the Middle East. And on the way, they took much of Syria, Palestine, Jordan, the Crusaders. But this European, West European expansion was driven back by the Arabs. And by the 15th century, it was on its last legs. And meanwhile, there had arisen this great, and we'll be speaking about it, this great new Islamic empire dominated by the Ottomans, this Turkish tribe, which was in the process of conquering the whole of the Middle East. And the central prize was the city of Constantinople. Well, in 1453, the Ottomans seized the city of Constantinople. And so we could say that at that point, the last outpost of the Christians in the Middle East was destroyed by the Muslims in 1453, this Muslim empire. And this was part of the consolidation. Simultaneously to taking Constantinople, the Sultan, who was the head of the state, was consolidating the Ottoman state, was this gigantic state dominating the Middle East. And the really threatening thing from the point of view of the West Europeans was that, of course, like the West Europeans, these Muslims were crusaders. They believed in conquest and the conversion of the subject peoples, if possible. And so the Ottomans invaded not merely the Middle East, but they had already taken Greece and the southern part of Europe. The Balkans was occupied by Ottoman armies. So there was a lot of concern in Europe. The Pope kept urging the nobility, restore the Crusades, and so on. But the West Europeans, they were so divided and had lost interest in pursuing these Crusades. And so it seemed even possible that the Turks might advance into Central Europe. And in fact, they did, as we will learn a little bit later. Now, from an economic point of view, the real problem was, well, the Ottomans, there are mortal enemies. And so how are we going to get the silks and spices that we're accustomed to? Because the main route for bringing Chinese and Indian and indeed Middle Eastern spices, luxury goods of every description, carpets, silks, they all came across the Mediterranean that had been doing this for centuries. And it was above all, the Venetians, merchants of Venice, but also merchants from Milan, merchants from Genoa, merchants from Florence, who grew rich out of this Mediterranean trade. Now suddenly the access to the Mediterranean trade is threatened by the consolidation of this empire. And so, in response to this, little Portugal, which, as I said, was completely marginal, nevertheless, they had their own crusading tradition. And one of these crusaders was a man by the name of Prince Henry. And Prince Henry had fought against the Arabs in North Africa. He had distinguished himself. He was a younger son of the King of Portugal, and he had been wounded. He couldn't remain a soldier, and so he decided that in response to the growing threat of the closing of the Mediterranean and the threat from the Ottomans, that he would become the patron of an attempt to find another route rather than the Mediterranean route, which was closing. That he would attempt to sponsor the exploration of the African coast in order to explore down the African coast, and perhaps there was some way in which ocean-going vessels could basically, sailing southward, they could find a way of reaching India. And that was basically the project. They also had ideas. Ethiopia, which was a civilized, sophisticated kingdom, which was Christian, well, the Portuguese had in their mind, well, maybe we can link up with the Ethiopians and somehow make an alliance with the Ethiopians. That was the idea. In any case, the trade across the Mediterranean was, in fact, disrupted for about 20 years. Eventually, the Sultan realized that, hey, this, from an economic point of view, if I want to fund my empire, allowing this trade across the Mediterranean, allowing the Venetians and the other Italian merchants to continue the trade is necessary, because the Ottoman Empire needs the revenue. So eventually the Venetian trade the Mediterranean route was restored and continued to be important. But meanwhile, Henry, who also, he was in contact with the Portuguese merchants, who were in contact with the merchants in Germany, which at this point had become an active center of commercial and manufacturing activity, that he began to sponsor a series of voyages down the west coast of Africa. And so year by year, the Portuguese began to establish outposts. They entered into negotiations with the tribal chiefs and kings who ruled on the west coast of Africa. Most importantly were the king of Mali, the king of Ethiopia, the king of the Congo plays an important role. But there were a substantial number of ports established by the Portuguese. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting, for example, the king of Mali. We know that around about the time of the taking of Constantinople, that the king of Mali was a Muslim, because the Muslims were very active in converting merchants on both the east and west coast of Africa. There was a lot of conversion to Islam, but not completely by any means. A lot of Africans wanted to retain their traditional religion, but some did convert to Islam. Well, the king of Mali was a Muslim, and he decided that he would make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And we know that this pilgrimage across the whole of the African continent to Mecca in Arabia, he had an enormous train of camels, maybe 2,000 camels. And he brought with him, it is said by the chroniclers, hundreds of pounds of gold, because Mali was a big gold producer. The reason I say that is it gives you an indication of the capacity of the king of Mali to centralize resources. And it gives you an idea that, that these places like Mali and Congo were highly developed economically. We know that there were cities, travelers' reports report a city, for example, in the Congo of 20,000 people. So we're talking about a west coast of Africa, which was substantially developed already at this point. And there was a significant merchant class um, amongst these people. In any case, so the Portuguese advanced down the coast of Africa, and while they're doing this, they begin to say to themselves, well, we have to find other ways of making money, of making this pay off. So they begin to develop a substantial trade with the West African merchants. And what do they trade? Well, they trade ivory, they trade, uh, there's some spices that they can get a hold of. Gold is very important. The Europeans need gold desperately because they need it for the purposes of exchange in Europe and potentially in Asia. So they're very interested in the gold that is being produced on the West African coast. So you have ivory and spices and gold, but also the Portuguese become interested in the slaves on offer in the marketplaces, in the West African markets. And some Portuguese merchants conceived the idea that offshore, the Portuguese sea captains discover islands. And I mentioned these islands in the key words. I'm talking about the Azores. I'm talking about the Cape Verde Islands. I'm talking about San Tome. They realize that there's a great market for sugar. And so Portuguese entrepreneurs set up sugar plantations, and they take about 150,000 slaves from the slave markets of West Africa, and they put them to work on these sugar slave plantations on these islands. Now, this makes a lot of money for Portugal, but and the profits attract the attention of a lot of other people, and so you see that no sooner is the New World discovered that in Brazil and in the Caribbean, these sugar plantations worked by African slaves begin to emerge in the 16th century. It's to supply the enormous consumer market that is developing for sugar in Europe. And this is a huge scale enterprise, and the Portuguese become very rich. Their particular the place which they particularly exploit is Brazil. The coast of Brazil is covered with Portuguese sugar plantations in the 16th century, and Brazil becomes a Portuguese colony. It's actually discovered by a Portuguese sea captain by the name of Cabral, because if you look at a map, Brazil is actually quite close to Africa. There is a sort of narrowing of the Atlantic, and Brazil and Africa are relatively close together. And so this Cabral, his ship wandered and happened to touch in Brazil. That's how the Portuguese discovered it. It became their colony, and it remained their colony until the beginning of the 19th century. So Brazil, this very lucrative colony, was discovered by the Portuguese at the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. But meanwhile, while this was happening, the search for a passage to India continued. And finally, in 1488, a Portuguese sea captain by the name of Diaz, his name D-I-A-Z, I've given in the keywords, He finally he sails a ship down the west coast of Africa to the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope, which is presently in the Republic of South Africa. He passes the Cape of Good Hope and he turns northward into the Indian Ocean. But he's so frightened by what he's done and so on, he's so uncertain. He turns back and he doesn't reach India. But he did discover that there was a route that you could get into the Indian Ocean from the Atlantic. And finally, in 1498, Vasco da Gama, another Portuguese sea captain, Vasco da Gama, in 1498, he repeats what Diaz has done, and he continues, and he strikes the southwest coast of India in 1498. He connects with the southwest coast of India, the Malabar coast, it's called. Okay, it's given him the key word. And this creates a lot of tension in Portugal, but indeed across Europe. Merchants are interested in this, and particularly German merchants. I would stress that behind the Portuguese are the Germans, German capital. Germany, in fact, at this time I'm speaking about, it's not England, it's not Holland. Germany is the center of the emergence of capitalism at this point. Germany is the most dynamic economy in Europe at this point. And there are very wealthy merchants and bankers in Germany who are backing the Portuguese. The Portuguese did not have the resources. They didn't have the manufactured goods. Especially, the Germans were very good at manufacturing two things: weapons and clocks, and even watches were being manufactured. And these found a market amongst the Africans, but even amongst the Indians. These guns were very interesting. And so they backed a second voyage of da Gama. And this time, instead of one single ship, he sent with a fleet of 21 sailing vessels down the west coast of Africa to the west coast of India. And he is there to trade, to bring back spices, to bring back silks, to bring back cotton goods, all the things that the Europeans want. The upper classes in Europe, the consumers, are accessible. But he finds that he receives a cold welcome. And in fact, he finds that everywhere the Portuguese go and try to establish trading relations, they're confronted with enemies. There are Turks, there are Egyptian merchants, there are Venetian merchants who are bitterly hostile to the Portuguese. And a series of battles occurs between the Portuguese and these rival merchants. Now, why would a Venetian merchant be opposed to the arrival of these Portuguese? What is the problem here? Yes.
Economically, the Venetians would lose money
Yeah.
from the trade that Portuguese.
Yes, you're threatening my trade goes through the Mediterranean. And you're arriving in this a completely new way, and you're going to take my business. And the Egyptians feel the same way. The Turks feel the same way. So there's a really kind of open warfare between these Portuguese and these rival merchants for a few years. And the Portuguese prevail because their ships and their guns are better. Their ships and guns are better than anything that their rivals can muster. And I would say, just as a kind of parenthesis, the ships the large vessels with their full set of sails and their deep cargo holds. These new kinds of sailing vessels gave the Portuguese mobility. It gave them firepower, which the Asian merchants and the Italians simply could not match. And so the Portuguese do consolidate their grip, and within a few years, they establish the headquarters of their empire in Asia at a place called Goa. Goa on the west coast of India becomes the center of an emerging Portuguese empire in the opening decades of the 16th century. So they have this trade with Africa that's continuing. They're establishing themselves in Brazil, and now they're opening up trade with India. And in 1504 already, every month, the Portuguese sent another ship to do business with the Indian merchants. And under the commander of the Portuguese Empire, or governor, his name was Albuquerque. He was an aristocrat. Alfonso de Albuquerque was the governor of the Portuguese of Goa and the head of the empire. The Portuguese established no less than 50 outposts, 50 trading posts across Asia are established by the Portuguese in the opening years of the 16th century. And they make sure that, particularly, they set up their outposts in key strategic points in order to try and control the trade. For example, in Indonesia, there is an important strait. It's important even now. The U.S. Navy is there. It's called the Malacca Straits. The Malacca Strait, and it's a choke point. And the trade of the Southeast Asia, much of it has to pass through the Malacca Straits. Portuguese seize that, establish a fort, and they try to establish control over trading movements so that the Asian merchants have to pay tariffs, tolls, and so on, and are subordinated to the Portuguese. Likewise, they try to control the mouth of the Persian Gulf. That's the outlet for the Venetian trade from the Mediterranean. Well, they fight big battles, and Albuquerque seizes control of this place called Hormuz, which is the choke point, which establishes Portuguese control over the Mediterranean trade. Well, this was a breakthrough, and it meant that the spices and silks and luxuries of Asia they could be moved in two ways, because the Portuguese trade got larger, but meanwhile the Venetians had reached an agreement with the Ottoman Sultan, and I have to say that the Mediterranean trade remained important as well. So you have two trading routes in the 16th century. They were rival. It was only at the end of the 16th century that the Atlantic route came to dominate. That the Atlantic route definitely became dominant in the European trade with Asia. Now, all of that having been said, I would say that the Portuguese, nevertheless, their empire, certain parts of it did remain with Portugal. I've already mentioned Brazil. The Portuguese were able to control Brazil until the beginning of the 19th century. And they also established their outposts in these islands that I've spoken about, but also on the west coast of Africa. They established a colony. The name of that colony was Angola, which of course today is a huge producer of oil and is today an independent state. The Portuguese only left under compulsion in 1975. And the same thing happened on the East Coast. They had another colony, Mozambique. So the Portuguese had these two colonies, Angola and Mozambique, which remained in Portuguese hands, and the Portuguese quietly exploited them for centuries until anti-imperialist movements developed in these two countries, and the Portuguese were chased out in the 1970s. So these were Portugal, although it quickly was eclipsed by other rising European powers. I'm speaking above all of the Dutch, but also the French and the English. Eventually, the Dutch couldn't compete with these still stronger European states. Nevertheless, they quietly continued to make money and exploit these colonies for centuries. However, Portugal, it has to be said, at the end of the day, was simply too weak a country. They only had 900,000 people. They did not have a huge demographic base to provide them with enough soldiers and sailors to really continue to be the dominant imperial power in Asia in the course of the 16th century. They're simply too weak, and their economy was too weak. The effort to establish this empire led them to neglect their internal manufacturing, their agriculture tended to wither, and so by the end of the 16th century, Portugal internally was less rich, I would say, especially the common people, than they were at the beginning of the 16th century. A few people, of course, the elites continued to be wealthy. And one other aspect that I have to mention is that they essentially destroyed their middle class. They allowed, for example, German manufacturers, which were more competitive, into Portugal, and the internal manufacture withered. But also, Portugal had a Jewish population, and the Jews were merchants. Many of them had been chased out of Spain, and I'll come to that story in a few minutes. And they tried to settle in Portugal, but the Spanish king, his name was Manuel, imitating what was going on in Spain in 1497, there were about 100,000 Jews living in Portugal. He chased them out, and there was no middle class left in Portugal. So that was an unfortunate step. I would say, though, one thing I would note as a parenthesis is that most of these Jews fled into the Ottoman Empire, which tended to be more tolerant. But some of them actually converted because of their their business interests. They nominally became Catholics, but secretly they were practicing Judaism, these people, and some of them made their way to places like Brazil or elsewhere in Latin America. And these Jewish merchants played a big role in the commercial development of Latin America, which is something that needs to be borne in mind. Portugal, while it had made this breakthrough, and it did acquire these colonies, which it retained for a long time, in Asia, their grip gradually faded, particularly as the major competitor was the Dutch, and they began to intrude at the end of the 16th and into the 17th century, and they became the leading European merchants and created an empire in Asia, as we'll see. So I want to, having dealt with the Portuguese, I want now to turn to the Spaniards. And here, the Spaniards, with the advice of this Genoese sea captain, Christopher Columbus, he was not Spanish, he was from Genoa. The the Spaniards, envious of what Portugal was doing, decided to launch their own exploration and discovery enterprise. And Columbus said that he believed that it was possible to, instead of sailing south along the coast of Africa, that India could be reached if you sailed from Spain westward across the Atlantic Ocean. This was his view. And the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, they listened to him. And in 1492, of course, a flotilla of 4 ships, captained by Columbus, sailed westward, and sure enough, they struck the coast of, I believe it was today, it would be Haiti and the Dominican Republic. That place was called Hispaniola. That was the first place that Columbus reached. The second stop was Cuba. Those were the places that Columbus's expedition landed. Well, I said that Columbus was Genoese, and I remarked earlier that the Portuguese merchants, in back of them was German capital. Well, in back of Columbus's voyage, in back of the enterprise patronized by the King and Queen of Spain, Italian capital, Italian money, German money backing the Portuguese, Italian money backed Columbus. Columbus himself was an Italian sea captain, and he was in the employ of bankers from Genoa, the city of Genoa. That was his birthplace, which is, of course, in the very north of Italy. And Genoa was one of the leading commercial and manufacturing cities of Italy. There were in Italy, and there had been since really the 12th century, 3 or 4 cities which they were the ones which developed the Mediterranean trade. Talking about the Venetians, the Genoese, the Milanese from Milan, and the Florentines. These cities rose in the Middle Ages, and they were still in existence at the beginning of the 16th century, end of the 15th century, and the beginning of the 16th century. These Italian cities, they were the centers of European commercial and manufacturing activity. They were the ones who imported all of the silks, the spices across the Mediterranean Sea, and they were already very involved in banking, in loaning money. The first great bankers of Europe came from these cities. And it was people like this in Genoa who backed Columbus. As a matter of fact, Spain, which of course became, as a result of its discoveries, its conquest of most of Latin America, and its discovery of the gold and silver in unlimited amounts, from Mexico and from Bolivia and Peru, made Spain a great power. But behind the scenes are these Italian bankers. That's what you have to realize. This money power is behind these enterprises. You could see the power, the surge of finance capital that lies behind this European exploration and discovery. Now, Columbus himself, when he arrived in Hispaniola and in Cuba, he thought, at least at the beginning, well, this is India. He thought he had reached India. And it took a few years for them to realize, oh no, this is a new continent. We don't know anything about it. So Columbus discovers America. Well, actually, we know, of course, that the Vikings were active. We know that possibly the Africans crossed the Atlantic during the Middle Ages. That's also a possibility that exists. We know that I spoke about the fishing and the fishing industry in what is today Holland, but also in Normandy in France, and indeed in Portugal and in the Basque country of Spain. These fishermen, they fished in the Baltic and the North Sea, but some of them already prior to Columbus might have made their way to Newfoundland, to the banks of Newfoundland, and began to fish for cod. And this is we don't have any written record of it, but it's possible that these European fishermen discovered the Americas before Columbus. It's difficult to say. In any case, Columbus discovers America. That is what is in the history books. Well, after a few years, they realized that indeed this was a new continent, and they had not reached Asia. They had not reached India. So the Spanish crown sponsored another voyage, and this time it was a sea captain by the name of Magellan, Ferdinand Magellan, in the key words, who, with the patronage, again, of the Spanish crown, he set sail from Seville in 1518, and he made his way down the sort of the coast of Brazil, which was known, and he was able to find a way to pass the Cape Horn. There's the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and Cape Horn is at the tip of Latin America. He passed into the Pacific Ocean, and he made his way across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippine Islands. And there he got into a fracas with some of the indigenous people, and they killed Magellan. And ultimately, only one of the 5 ships that set out was able to circumvent the globe. This is the first voyage around the globe, the Magellan expedition. And they came back to Spain, and they brought a fabulous cargo of spices, porcelain, silks, whatnot. And the Spanish, using this alternate route opened up by Magellan around the tip of Latin America, they opened up still another route to Asia in this way. And the Spanish route became very substantial. One must not underestimate. You have the Mediterranean route, you have the South Atlantic route, and then you have the Spanish route. Because the Spanish, every year, they sent fleets of vessels from Latin America, particularly from Mexico. They loaded up fleets full of silver, which they had discovered in Mexico, and they shipped them through the Philippines to China and even to India. And they in this way, were able to take part in the Asian trade. Now, I want to say a last word about the Philippine Islands. The Philippine Islands became the hub of this Spanish traffic. The people there spoke Tuareg, they may have spoken other languages as well. The mass of the population there were peasants. Some were hunters and gatherers. There was already a Chinese merchant elite established in the Philippine Islands, and the Spaniards entered into fights, wars with these Chinese merchants, and eventually the Spaniards seized control of the Philippine Islands. They named it after their king, Philip II. So with that, the Spaniards basically established a route to Asia, and as we'll see next time, starting with Columbus, they sent soldiers into Mexico, into Central America, and down into the South American continent, and they established a huge settler colony, Spain, using crusading techniques. They basically established a huge, powerful colonial empire centered on the production of silver and gold, as we'll see next time.